Greetings and welcome again, ladies and gentlemen. We're picking up with section 2 of Unit 1, the pre-Columbian era. And in this section, we're going to be looking at some early civilizations that flourished here in the Americas prior to the arrival of European whites. Now, before we begin, I have found it very useful to define a couple of terms that we often all use, but we really don't know what they might mean sometimes. So if you'll bear with me, we're going to define a couple of very key terms. Think of this as vocabulary, if you will, for this particular section. And the first one we're going to talk about is the word society. We've always heard this term society, but what does it actually mean? Think about that. What does society mean? What is a society? And if you were thinking that a society could be defined as a community of people living in a particular country or region and having a shared customs, shared laws, and organizations, you would be correct. So that is a society. Now think about what that means, though. It's a community of people living in a particular country or region and having shared customs, laws, and organizations. Are we a society in my classroom, classroom 12 at Jackson Junior High? Yeah, I think so. We're a community living in a particular region, at least for 90 minutes or an hour, and having shared customs and laws and organization. Are we a society at the junior high, a society at Jackson? And I think the answer to that is absolutely. And you could go all the way up to we have an American society. The second word I think we need to define is the word culture. Another word we throw around a lot, but what does it actually mean? And culture, I always like to think of it as the stuff. It's a way of life for a group of people. The behaviors, the beliefs, the values, the symbols that they accept and are passed along by communication and imitation from one generation to the next. So if you think about it, it's the way of life passed from one generation to the next, from father to son to grandson and so on, or grandmother to mother to daughter and so on. They are passing along how to act, what to believe, what to cherish, what symbols are important to them. And so we get into things like art and literature are parts of our culture. And so culture is a little bit different from society. They are somewhat similar. A lot of people use those words interchangeably, but they don't really go together. The final vocab term is another C word, and it's kind of the big one, civilization. What the heck is a civilization? And I'm going with a pretty standard definition here of a civilization. It is a complex society. Now think about what a society is, and you can go back and check what that is in just a second, with 5 characteristics. Okay, so it's got 5 pieces to it. First of all, they have to have advanced cities. If we have a civilization living in a hut in the middle of the desert, it's not really a civilization. Okay, it could be a society, it could be part of the culture, but it's not a civilization. An advanced city, by definition, is a city with a lot of preparation. For example, I would call an advanced city a city that is laid out in a particular way. It doesn't just grow haphazard here, there, and everywhere. So it's laid out perhaps on a grid pattern with streets that are identified. An advanced city would have public works to bring in water or take away sewage. So we're talking about planning a specific city. We are not talking about a settlement that just pops up and grows. Second, specialized jobs. Now, what is meant by this is not everyone is going to do the exact same thing. Now, you think about hunter-gatherers, they did not have specialized jobs. Everybody hunted. Everybody gathered food. Everybody shared in the workload. Okay, that is not a specialized job. Once we get to a civilization, we get to this point where jobs can become very individual. For example, Susie becomes a paper maker, and Bob becomes a blacksmith, and Joe becomes a I don't know, a librarian. I don't know. But they all have specialized jobs. This is allowed because they have a plentiful food source. And so they don't all have to spend their time being hunters or gatherers. Third, complex institutions. Now, this could be a number of things. This could be you have a very organized economy. It could be you have an organized religion of some sort. It could be some sort of system of laws through a court system or a ruler. So we have these institutions that kind of control what goes on within the civilization. So whatever they may be, economic, political, religious, you name it. And fourth, there's a type of record keeping. Now, whether it's a full-blown writing or if it's a system of keeping track of numbers, whichever, record keeping is going to be very important to be defined as a civilization. And fifth and finally, improved technology. Now, this one is perhaps one of the hardest. I'm not talking about improved technology. I am not talking about your smartphone. That is improved technology for us. Improved technology to someone 2,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, may be using the wheel. Okay. Oddly enough, the wheel was kind of known in Central America, but it was never used for transportation. It was used as a children's toy. And until the arrival of Europeans, the wheel was not really used here. But there are other types of technology that can be used. Technology could be as simple as irrigation techniques. It could be a way of making spear points in a different way. An improved technology is something that has changed from an older, more inefficient way of doing something. So keep that in mind. You don't have to be talking about technological gadgets to be improved technology. It's just a better way of doing something. So with those things in mind, we're going to look at three civilizations coming up. And we're going to call these the great civilizations of the Americas. And they all are going to contribute pieces to us even still today. And so I have here on the screen three illustrations. First of all, we have the Maya from Central America. They have these mighty stone temples and so forth. We have the Mississippian cultural center of Cahokia, which is really not that far from us. And third and finally, we have the Anasazi of the American Southwest, what we would now call Arizona and New Mexico. And they have these magnificent cliff-dwelling palaces that can hold hundreds and hundreds of people in these apartment-like buildings. So we're going to explore these three civilizations very quickly here today. And we're going to start with the Maya. And like my other dates, this is a range date, 250 to about 900. Did the Maya exist before this? Yes. Do they exist after this? Yes. This is kind of their golden age time frame. Okay, this is when they were at kind of their height, if you will. And they lived in what is now Mexico, southern Mexico, particularly the Yucatan Peninsula. They live in what is now Guatemala, Belize, El Salvador, Honduras. They were spread out over a very large part of what we would call Central America. They are one of the most advanced civilizations in the world before the arrival of Europeans. And they're at their height during this particular time period, like I said. And here is one of their most famous buildings. This is often just simply called the Great Pyramid of Chichen Itza. Chichen Itza is one of their major cities on the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. It is often called El Castillo by the Spanish, means the castle. So it kind of gives you an idea of how grand this particular building is. But yes, this is stonework, ladies and gentlemen. So think about the labor and the organization it's going to take to build this temple. And it's going to be a massive undertaking. And it's not just this temple that they're building. They're building hundreds of other temples surrounding this particular pyramid structure. So we have a lot of development of civilization here with the Maya. And those of you who like maps like I do, I love maps. I love me a good map. You see here in green, the Yucatan Peninsula. taking in what is now Belize and Guatemala and Honduras. This whole area was under Mayan control. And right there is Chichen Itza that we just talked about. Tulum, some of you have been to Cancun perhaps. Tulum is maybe 30 or 45 minutes away. Tikal is another huge Mayan city-state that was really important during their time. So it gives you kind of an idea of where they are. And a little bit more about the Maya. Of course, their defining characteristics is they built these large pyramids to honor their gods. Now, they are smaller than the Egyptian pyramids we're all familiar with, but they are much more detailed. They are carved in elaborate scenes or frescoes that cover the surface of the pyramid. These temples are used in religious ceremonies, and they're going to be really important to the Maya. The Mayan religion itself was a big, big part of their civilization. They were polytheistic, which means they believed in many different gods. And they make offerings to these gods in the form of food or animal sacrifices, blood sacrifice, human sacrifices to please them. And yes, it was considered an honor to be chosen for a sacrifice. Now, we have trouble with that today, but these people believed that it was their honor, their duty to their people, and the well-being of their people to be chosen and to go through the ritual of sacrifice. And here in this piece of art, we have some Mayan priests. Some are dressed quite exotically, some not as much, but they are sacrificing a jaguar. And the jaguar was a very feared animal of the Mayan people. It was indigenous to the area. It was a hunter. It was a predator. They feel its strength makes it a very important animal for sacrifice. And here they are going to basically cut out its heart on this altar. It's going to be thrown into this pit or burned ceremonially. And by doing so, it'll release the spirit to the gods, and the gods will favor the Maya. That's their idea. And of course, human sacrifice. Now check out this image. It's quite terrifying. First, we have the human sacrifice. He's pulled over an altar. He's had a knife and looks like a hammer perhaps have been hammered into him. His heart has been ripped out by the gods. The god is eating the heart, and he is gaining the strength of the sacrifice, and he is going to shower that strength back onto the Mayan people. So it's a bloodthirsty group in our modern interpretation, but the Mayans had a lot of really advanced accomplishments. First of all, they developed a system of mathematics and a numbering system using zero. Now, zero is kind of a unique number. I don't do math well. I think I've mentioned this before. But if you don't have zero, it's hard to keep track of numbers. It's hard to count and make your math work. No other civilization in North America used the concept of zero, just the Maya. They developed this quite independently of everyone else. They also had an independently developed a language system. This was a written language, not just spoken, but written. And guys, this is incredibly important because this is actually the one of, I think, 6 or so independently developed written language systems in world history. So the Mayans had this huge accomplishment of recording their language in their own way. They had a completely accurate calendar, 365 days. They could predict eclipses. They could tell you when the sun would rise and the sun would set, which moon would be showing at which particular time of the month. So the Mayans were quite accurate. They understood the heavens. They understood the rotation of the stars. They knew a lot of astronomy. They had knowledge of the phases of the moon, the cycles of the planet Venus. They knew about the existence of Mars, the planet. So these people were quite advanced for their time. Moving on, the Anasazi. We have about 100 BC to about AD 1300. Remember, some before, some after. This is a wide 1200-year range. We probably split it down the middle, go right around 7 to 800 AD was probably when they're at their height. They are also known as the Ancient Ones, or the ancestral people. And today they are the ancestors of a lot of what we would call Native American tribes of our Southwest. The Navajo, the Pima, etc., all call these their ancestors. They too built large city complexes from dried bricks of mud. We usually call these adobe. They take mud, they toss in some grasses or hay-like substance. They dry it in the sun. It becomes very hard, and it's very useful for building. They built these mud cities or brick complexes into cliff faces. These cliff faces offer protection from the sun, from the rain, from the heat of Arizona and New Mexico. And these apartment complexes that they would build could hold hundreds or thousands of people. And these people were farmers. To support a large population of 2,000 people, you have to have a steady supply of food. And farming is where it's at. They're going to farm corn, squash, and a lot of other crops. But corn and squash are their two main food crops that support them. Now remember, they are in Arizona and New Mexico. It is very hot. It is very dry. So how did they make corn and squash become a major food staple? It was through irrigation. They use irrigation to water their crops. And so this is one of those complex systems we were talking about a while ago. An irrigation system is coming in to water the ground to make it good farmland so these people can flourish. Here's a map showing some of those early civilizations of the desert Southwest. The Hohokam were a little bit earlier, as were the Magellans. You can see they were very large and spread out. But here's the Anasazi, and it was centered right around what we call the Four Corners region. Some of you may have been to the Four Corners before. This is where Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico all come together. So right in here is what we call the Four Corners region today. Now, obviously, that didn't exist back then, but this whole area was under the control of the Anasazi. And they built magnificent cities. This is an image of what they called a kiva, an underground center of worship. It's built into the ground with mud brick. It's roofed over with what wood they could find. You enter from the roof. These are ceremonial religious centers. And here's probably one of the more famous buildings they built. This is what we call the Cliff Palace at Mesa Verde National Park. It is in right here in southern Colorado. And it's a misnomer. It is not a palace. These are apartment dwellings. This was not a royal apartment like we think of a palace built for a king. These were common everyday people living and working in the area. They would come down into the valley below the cliff. This is where the water would be. They would hunt on top of the mesa. Would be where their farmland was. They would bring in water from as far as 12 miles away to water. And so these were quite advanced folks. And you can see these were quite advanced apartment dwellings. This is another view of the exact same location. I'm saying this is apartment living at its best. But this irrigation is kind of their defining civilization technique. They could do it a variety of ways. They had canal irrigation where they dug ditches that brought water from rivers. They had floodgates and trencherias that flooded the fields. They used something called lithic mulch. And behind my big head here in the bottom left of your screen, you have an example of lithic mulch. Some of you may have helped a parent spread mulch around the house, around flower beds or something. Instead of mulch, some of you may have used decorative rock. It's the same idea. Whether it's wood mulch or decorative rock, it shades the ground and it helps hold the moisture next to the plant. So the plant gets the benefit of as much moisture as possible, allowing it to grow. Lithic means stone. And we have here an example of that lithic mulch. We have the stone surrounding this plant. And basically they are cultivating their crops in a floodplain, as you can see here. This way they get as much water as possible on their crops so that they don't have to bring it as far. Our final civilization is kind of my personal favorite, the Mississippian, also called the Mound Builders. They too have a large range of time period, about AD 600 to about AD 1600. Some people would say it would be more accurate to say 1500, but this is a broad range for the Mississippians. They are called the Mound Builders, and it's actually a group of three different ones, the Adena, the Hopewell, and the Mississippian. They all live in the same area. They all have a lot of the same common elements. Their culture changed a little bit over time, and so that's why we have these three different pieces. But we're going to concentrate on the Mississippian people. They have an advanced agricultural system. Corn, beans, and squash. This is often called Three Sisters. You're going to hear that term a lot. So Three Sisters agriculture, corn, beans, and squash. And I'm going to talk about that in more detail here in just a moment. They have a lot of tradition, religion, and customs that maintained their way through 1,000 years of history. Some of their most prominent features, they're called the Mound Builders, guys. So think about what they're actually doing. They're building structures out of earth. They're making earthen mounds and earthen pyramids. And a lot of these were for religious use. Some of them were used as dwellings for the ruling class. Now, they are not living in a mound of dirt. They're living on top of it. So you build a large mound of dirt, you get to live on top. You're setting yourself above everyone else. And so it was, obviously a ploy to say, I'm a little bit above you by being closer to the sky. North America, Mississippian and related cultures, like I said, the Adena and the Hopewell, and you have the South Appalachians, you have the Fort Ancient peoples. You got a lot of different groups, but we're really looking right here in the heartland. We're looking right here in the heartland of the country. This is the Mississippi River right here. This is where most of the Mississippian civilization is going to be centered. And a lot of the towns are going to be right along that river. They are going to have extensive trade. If you are on the banks of the Mississippi, you have access to the majority of the North American continent. From the Great Lakes in the north to the Gulf of Mexico in the south, from almost the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Rocky Mountains. You're going to have a large, large territory over which you can trade. And this means your economy is going to be very large and based on trade goods. The superhighway of the time, and you're going to get tired of me saying this, are rivers. It is much, much easier to get on the Mississippi in your canoe and go downstream than it is to walk along the banks. Now remember, there are no interstate highways. There are no cars. There are no trains or airplanes. So you are down to two modes of transportation. You go by foot or you go by water. Water is much more efficient. And besides, if you're a trader and you're going all the way out here to this is would be Virginia on the banks of the Ohio. You're going to trade for goods out here and bring them back to the banks of the Mississippi and what is Arkansas right here. You're not going to go on foot and carry all those trade goods. You're going to go by canoe on the river, and you're going to be able to load that canoe down with those trade goods. So the economy is going to be based on these superhighways. You got the Mississippi River that bisects the continent. The Ohio goes to the east. The Missouri goes to the west. You have an incredibly large trade network is what I'm trying to get to you here. The major city of the Mississippians, not necessarily their capital, but perhaps the largest of all these cities, was Cahokia, also called the City of the Sun. And this is a painting of what we think Cahokia would look like. We have a really good idea since many of these mounds still exist today. In fact, you can go visit Cahokia. It is only about 2 hours away. It's just across the river from St. Louis in Illinois, in what is called Collinsville. And you can actually, this large mound right here, which is, we call it Monk's Mound today, is still there, as are these two mounds. There's a conical one, it's a cone, and a small pyramid-shaped mound, as well as several of these other mounds are all still in existence. Now, it is located just a mile, it's about 6 miles from the juncture of the Mississippi and Missouri River. So think about how important its location is. It can get to places very, very quickly by canoe, by doing that. It had an incredibly large population. By 1150, may have had as many as 30,000 people. 40,000, I've read that number a few times. I think it's incredibly high. If we go 20 to 30, I think we're more in line. But think about this. In 1150, the city of London did not have 20,000 people. We think of London, England as being this huge metropolitan area, and it is. But in 1150, Cahokia, right here in the heart of what is now North America, was larger. And Cahokia would remain the largest city in North America all the way up to the year 1800, when Philadelphia gained more people finally. And so it's going to take years and years and years to replace the metropolis that is Cahokia. Sadly, by the year 1700, probably by about 1650, Cahokia is completely abandoned. No one lives there. And there's a lot of mystery as to why the people of Cahokia disappeared. But I think it's actually pretty obvious, and it comes down to some real basic facts. Here's another painting of Cahokia. You get the idea of how these people lived. This is a earthen mound. These people built this by digging dirt out of a pit and piling it up under specific directions to build this mound. Their houses are made of wooden logs. The bottom piece is sheathed with what we would call wattle. It's dried mud, hair, things like that. And then it's thatched with reeds on top. Makes a very, very watertight ceiling. It's good for about a year, and then you have to replace the thatching. Massive organization to build Cahokia. So check this, my math out here. Monk's Mound, it is estimated that it took 22 million cubic feet of dirt to make this mound. By the way, Monk's Mound is larger than the Great Pyramid of Egypt at its base. It is not as tall, but at its base, it is larger than the Great Pyramid of Egypt. 22 million cubic feet of dirt. One basket of dirt, this is what one person would carry at a time, weighs about 55 pounds, or 1.5 cubic feet of dirt. So doing the math, much more advanced than what I can do, to construct Monk's Mound, you need over 14.5 million baskets of dirt. That's incredible. What that basically means, if we took 30 students, and there's 25 or so of you in the classroom right now, carrying 8 baskets a day, every day, it would take you 167 years to build Monk's Mound. Now, obviously, when we build Monk's Mound, we're going to have more than 30 people working on it, but it is still going to take decades to completely build what we call Monk's Mound. That's this large mound right here, or this large mound right here. It's the same image. It's the same mound, just from a different perspective. So we're talking massive social organization. We have to have workers carrying the dirt. We have to have workers digging the holes to get the dirt. We have to have architects and construction workers that know how the dirt should be placed and where. We have someone to organize the work schedules, someone to feed these people. So you're talking massive social organization to build something as simple as we think of this mound of dirt. Now, they did more than just build mounds. They also built what we call effigy mounds. An effigy is something that resembles something living. So sometimes they built mounds that resembled a living animal. This is the Great Serpent Mound in Ohio. You can see why it's called a serpent. It resembles a snake swallowing an egg. Now, the really unique thing about this mound, first of all, check out the dimensions. 1,348 feet long. That's taking the tail, tracing it through all the curves, the undulations of the body, all the way to the tip of the egg. 1,348 feet. Okay, a football field is 300 feet. So this is slightly longer than, 4 football fields. It is almost exactly 3 feet tall through the entire length of this mound. And it's about 6 feet wide. Now, think about this for a moment. How do you build a structure this long, this tall, this wide from ground level? They did not have aerial photography to direct them in how to build this. So they are obviously building this as part of some massive religious ceremony, hoping that their gods or their belief system can look down and see this offering of this great serpent swallowing an egg. Some people say it's a symbol of rebirth. Some say it's a symbol of life. Whichever you prefer, it doesn't really matter. But it's a massive and unique architectural element created by the Mississippian people. Now, I said a while ago, why didn't Cahokia fall apart? And the answer is simple: poor resource management. Look at the statistics for just firewood. If a family of 4, mom, dad, little Johnny, and little Susie, require 1.5 treetops per year for firewood. Now remember, you're going to have a fire all year because this is what you cook on too. This is not just for heat, this is cooking. So you have a fire going all year. Family of 4, 1.5 treetops. Now we're not talking about the main trunk of the tree. We're talking about the limbs and everything else that have been broken off, cut with stone tools, and used for firewood. 1.5 treetops. Cahokia at 20,000 people would mean that's 5,000 fires burning per day. So 4 into 20,000, 5,000 fires. Over the course of 1 year, that means 7,500 treetops are going to be used, or 22 trees per year are going to be cut down, or per day will be cut down. Now, if you go back to this picture, where's the forest? There's a little bit out here around this swampy looking area, right? But the forest has been cut and cleared. These are all fields out here, fields of corn and beans and squash. But where's the woods? Where's the forest? You keep having to go further and further and further away to get that wood resource that you need to live every single day. Pretty soon, if you're walking 10 miles to get firewood, is it worth it? Or do you just move your home? And so this is why we think Cahokia was eventually abandoned. It was poor resource management. They did not, they cut all the trees and they couldn't sustain the population for what they needed. This is Monk's Mound today. It looks a little bit different than it did in that illustration I showed you earlier. You can go visit this in Collinsville. You can walk up these steps all the way to the top. The view from the top is spectacular. I would really highly encourage you to go to Cahokia Mounds today. Very much worth the trip. It's one of my favorite places. But the mound builders centered in Cahokia, they had trade centers. They had different institutions, government, religion, record keeping. They had tools. And having all these characteristics, this means the mound builders were what? They were definitely a civilization. And I'm sorry my big head is above the sea in civilization. But you get the idea. This is Monk's Mound. So this is the scene it would have looked like at a little marketplace. People are going to be very busy trading goods. And yes, we believe tattooing was very, very common among the Mississippians, especially those of higher social class. This little tributary, this little creek, you can see it's full of canoes. People are traveling up and down the creeks and the rivers, constantly trading goods. So we've just looked at these three big civilizations: the Anasazi in the desert Southwest, in what we call New Mexico and Arizona today. Their big key was, of course, irrigation and their cliff palaces or cliff buildings out of dried adobe brick. We looked at the Maya, uh, who their concept of zero and their ideas of a written language that they developed independently, and their massive stone temples were quite impressive. And the Mississippians, who dominated the heartland of what we now call North America, and their trade networks were extensive, reaching from the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic, and from what is now Canada to Mexico. So these people were quite advanced. And these three civilizations were three of the biggest. They weren't the only ones, but they were certainly the largest in the area. And so hopefully you kind of pulled a few things out of that. And this is kind of going to wrap up the end of section 2 for our chapter, the pre-Columbian era. In our next section, we're going to be looking at cultural regions of North American Indian populations. So we're going to look at how people differed living in different parts of the continent. Thank you.